The city is considering plans for the single largest piece of new development since the transformation of the South Boston waterfront into the Seaport District. The changes that come at Suffolk Downs could mean new housing, office, retail, and open space. But lawyers for civil rights are also trying to make sure the review process has even stronger participation from the surrounding community in East Boston. To tell us about comments on the proposal recently sent to the Boston Planning and Development Agency is a staff attorney with Lawyers for Civil Rights, Lauren Sampson. Thank you very much for being with us, Lauren.
Thank you for having me.
Lauren, first of all, talk about what something of the size and scale at Suffolk Downs could mean for the surrounding neighborhood and all those displacement pressures we've been hearing about lately.
Absolutely. Suffolk Downs can't be considered apart from the context of development taking place in East Boston. Over the past 7 to 8 years, about 19 large residential projects approximating multi-million-dollar developments have entered the city of Boston, and particularly East Boston, without any consideration of what that large-scale development will mean as a whole. How do we ensure that those who currently live in East Boston, a predominantly low-income neighborhood with lots of immigrant communities, people that are protected and can keep their local institutions, businesses, and cultural places of worship? For example, at Suffolk Downs, we have really pushed the developers to integrate and include immigrant members of the community into their conversations by simple things like making sure every document is translated into Spanish, or that they have individuals at their meetings who are knowledgeable about development terms and can talk intelligibly in Spanish to community members about what's to come.
Now, the classic cases of community participation are, let's say, if you're redeveloping a public housing development, you have a lot of meetings with renters, or if you're talking about a building that's in your own neighborhood, if you live down the street, you go to a meeting. We're talking about people who might be maybe a half a mile or a quarter mile away from Suffolk Downs. Why should they be engaged?
This is an argument that HYM, the developer in this instance, has brought up over and over again. They continually tell us in the East Boston community, no one currently lives at Suffolk Downs. We're not displacing anyone. But that overlooks the larger pressure that a development of this size, as you said, Chris, unprecedented in Boston's history, will have on the surrounding areas. 15 million square feet of development, over 100 acres, is inevitably going to cause pressure on the surrounding communities and raise rents for them. We're already seeing that happen with large-scale development in East Boston. Another example is Assembly Row in Somerville, a place where, again, no one was living, but the creation of multi-million-dollar condominiums and the induction of luxury retail meant that rents around Somerville greatly increased. So for the developers to say, you're not affected because you live half a mile or a mile away, overlooks the pressure that this will place on the entire neighborhood.
Of course, one other issue that City Councilor Lydia Edwards has been looking at for quite a while is whether or not this turns out to be a gated community. To what extent do people who don't actually live there need to get in and not even have to go through a gate, maybe?
One of our central concerns is that even as the developer describes this space as public and open, that won't really be true if it's private and can be, for example, guarded by private guards. It's one thing to say we're going to have, 40 acres of open space. It's another thing to actually deed that to the city or to have permanent easements that mean that anyone can access that space to have a public protest or even to play soccer. What we need to see is that if money is being poured into East Boston, that money actually benefits the long-term residents who live there so that they can take advantage of the space that's being developed.
Okay. This is BNN News, and we're talking with Lauren Sampson from Lawyers for Civil Rights. Lauren, one of the things you're trying to look at here is the choreographing of the approval process by the Boston Planning and Development Agency. You want to make sure this isn't just sort of high speed, rammed through. So what do you think needs to be done?
In this instance, Lawyers for Civil Rights is very concerned that HYM is trying to get approvals of its major processes by the end of this year. Now, construction is estimated to take about 20 years, which means it'll be about 2 decades before individuals can really fully move into and fully start to embrace Suffolk Downs as a neighborhood. But think about what that means in terms of public participation. A child who is right now 5 years old, who will be of voting age and tax-paying age by the time the development is being constructed, won't have the opportunity to weigh in on these processes if approvals are just granted by the end of 2019. We are urging HYM and the BPDA to slow down, to engage the community more fully, and to get the maximum number of input possible in order to ensure we really make sure that community benefits are received in these instances.
One thing I've heard from the developers is that they're following normal timelines here. So what's the problem?
Nothing can really be normal when we have a project of this size and scale. The best example we have for Suffolk Downs is the seaport. And we in the city of Boston look at the seaport as a failure, as a neighborhood that could have been inclusive and was not, as a neighborhood that could have been livable and was not, as a neighborhood that could have been affordable and was not. In order to ensure we don't get another seaport, which is the closest thing to a development of this size that we've seen, we need to make sure we take our time and get this right.
Another thing that you're looking at here is translation, because you can literally translate the verbiage from a development meeting into another language, but something's going to get lost. So how do you keep that from happening?
One thing that we've pushed for is to ensure that there's translation that actually makes sense to the community members, that you're not just straightforwardly or verbatim translating a statement that doesn't have any context for a community member. So we've pushed, for example, to have someone who actually works in the field of architecture or planning, who's knowledgeable about these topics, to actually give these presentations in Spanish, rather than just having someone do translation who isn't familiar with all these terms and can't explain it in context or just says the word in English, which leaves community members confused and unable to participate fully. This is, of course, a requirement of federal law to ensure that grantees like the BPDA actually ensure that folks who don't speak English have access to these processes and learn what the developer is planning.
Now, what we're talking about right now is a plan that has evolved quite a bit over the last couple of years. Even Councilor Edwards says that. So is there room here for much new to be put into this plan to help the community?
At Lawyers for Civil Rights, we certainly think so, and our comments submitted to the BPDA on behalf of and in conjunction with several other community groups talk about the kind of things we'd like to see. Increased linkage payments, for example, increased payments to a housing stabilization fund, commitments to ensure that retail space is shared with women-owned businesses and businesses owned by people of color, commitments to implicit bias training for the private security guards who will be working on the site as construction takes place. There is a lot more that HYM can do to make sure that this development truly benefits the residents of East Boston.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Lauren Sampson from Lawyers for Civil Rights.